same idea. Fill up one last glass of wine before we get started. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to this beautiful setting. Is that better? Here in the Cox School of Business. And I know we have several Cox faculty who are with us tonight. And, this is just a beautiful venue. And somebody was complaining the air conditioning was down too low. Well, not for me. It's just hot in Texas right now. And I like a cooler room. But my name is Jim Hollifield, and I am the director of the Tower Center. And some of you may be here for the first time, especially some students or other guests from the outside. We want to encourage you to keep an eye on what's going on in the center. We have another program on Friday about a minor topic, which is democracy in Mexico. So we hope that we will see you at that event as well. For any of you who are in the back of the room, we've liberated some of these front row seats, so don't be bashful about coming in and taking a seat. We got a little bit bigger turnout than we expected for this, but I think that reflects the importance of this topic. It's been a very hot topic, and on the way down here, we were commenting that Ukraine has sort of fallen off the news a little bit.
Thanks to Ebola.
Thanks to Ebola and other things. But if you're a foreign policy or national security scholar, it just keeps on coming. And somebody was saying they can't remember so many crises going on at the same time in world politics, and I think that's true. But clearly, what's happened in Ukraine and Russia is extraordinarily important for American national security, for American interests, and we have two really great experts, commentators tonight joining us. Mr. Kramer, who is coming from Freedom House. I don't know how many of you know about Freedom House. He probably will tell you a little bit more about it in a minute. And he will be introduced by my colleague, Josh Rovner, who is moderating the session this evening. And I've been reading some of their things. I think they have a slight difference of opinion on what's going on in Ukraine and what American policy should be. So let's not let them get off lightly. We want to see some of those differences coming out in the discussion tonight. And I'm sure they will as we get into the Q&A. So why don't we give our visitor, Mr. Kramer, a big round of applause and welcome. Properly introduced now by my colleague Josh Rovner, who holds the Tower Chair in National Security at SMU. Josh?
Great. Well, thanks very much, Jim, and thanks everybody for coming. Terrific turnout. Thank you to our guest, David Kramer, as well. I'll tell you a little bit about our format tonight. Mr. Kramer will speak for about a half an hour or so, give or take. I will offer a few comments, but I won't speak for too long because we want to hear from you. So I have prepared remarks which I will probably ignore, and I will just throw it open to the floor and we'll have a good conversation. There's a lot of interesting things to discuss, and I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions for our speaker, who is David Kramer, the president of Freedom House, which he joined in October 2010. Mr. Kramer has a pretty remarkable career, and some of the highlights are in your handout tonight. He has extensive experience in the think tank world at Freedom House, at the Carnegie Endowment, at the Project for a New American Century, and at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He has extensive government experience, including a stint as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, as well as Deputy Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs. Beyond all that, he's got a very solid academic pedigree, having lectured at Clark University in Worcester, Mass., where I also lectured for a time. So we do have something in common, despite our public differences. And it's a real pleasure to have him here. So with that, I will turn over the floor to David Kramer.
Great, Josh. Thanks very much, and I hope you applaud at the end as well as at the beginning. A real pleasure to be back in Dallas, and my sincere thanks to Jim and the Tower Center for inviting me to come down and join you here today. It is always good to get outside the Beltway, and although I just came back Monday from Sweden, so if I fall asleep while I'm speaking, just let me sleep and make sure I don't fall off the chair. But my thanks very much, Josh, for that. And let me just say a word about Freedom House, if I can. And I'm actually going to be stepping down in my position next month. I've been there for 4 years. It is a fantastic organization. It's the oldest democracy human rights organization in the United States, founded in 1941 to confront 4 isms that were challenges to the U.S. at that time: Nazism, fascism, communism, but also isolationism in the United States. And it is a bipartisan organization with strong support from its first days from Eleanor Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie, and it has maintained that bipartisan approach ever since. We do 3 main things. One is reports. We issue annual reports, one called Freedom in the World, in which we break countries down into 3 categories. We were talking about this: free, partly free, and not free. We've been doing that since 1972. It's the longest kind of report in existence. We do a Freedom of the Press report that focuses on press issues. A more recent report focuses on net freedom, and that report will be coming out in December, 5th year of that. And then there's a special report, an annual report we do called Nations in Transit, that focuses on the Eurasian region as well as East Central Europe and the Balkans. And that has been done for quite a few years now. So we do reports. So we assess and analyze what's happening in various countries and parts of the world. Then we try to do something about it. So we do programming, where we have about 13 offices around the world where we work with civil society activists, human rights defenders, democracy advocates. And we do try to work with governments where there is interest in working with us. It hasn't always been the case. We had a miserable experience the past few years in Egypt, where we were one of the NGOs that was raided in December 2011, along with 3 other American organizations and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I had 7 staff put on trial last June, an absurd case, and 43 defendants were found guilty. Fortunately, we took, along with the other organizations, all of our Egyptian staff out of the country before the anticipated verdict. I cite that just to give you an example that some of the work we do can be pretty risky. Fortunately, we don't have those problems everywhere we work, where we do have interest in governments working together with us and civil society, but some of the work we do is pretty risky. We do that on a regular basis. So we do the research, the programming. Third component is our advocacy work. This makes us unique from other organizations because we're the only organization in the human rights democracy field that does all 3 things. Other organizations do 2 of those 3 or 1 of those 3. We do all 3. And by advocacy, we mean bringing activists to UN meetings, such as in Geneva for the Human Rights Council, getting behind certain legislation. For example, in 2012, the Sergei Magnitsky Act, which I'll talk about a little later, and trying to raise the level of awareness and call for strong U.S. leadership, along with engaging with partners and allies to try to promote the cause of freedom, democracy, and human rights around the world. And we engage with the White House, with the Congress, as well as in the media by trying to produce articles and op-eds and other things to try to raise the level of awareness. And I should always say, you should shut your phones off before you speak, because this could be really rude.
Egypt calling there.
Exactly. They didn't like what I said. Sorry about that. Hopefully, let me shut that off so it doesn't happen again. Let me turn to Russia as I try to get the. Well, anyway, if this goes off, ignore it. You stole my first line, Jim, which was I was going to say that the Ukraine crisis has not been in the news much lately. In fact, I happened to notice when I got back from Sweden on Monday, the Washington Post hasn't had a story about it in 2 or 3 days, which is the longest period I can remember where there hasn't been a story about the situation. It has been on a daily basis, whether it's the New York Times, the Journal, the Washington Post, or other sources, where it's either been on the front page or certainly in the international sections talking about this crisis, which has really been going on now for almost a year, starting with the protests that erupted in Ukraine in November. As you rightly said, it doesn't mean that this crisis is over or resolved. In fact, fighting is picking up yet again in Donetsk, particularly focused on the airport, which Ukrainian government forces have control over, but the Russian-supported rebels are fighting back and trying to gain control over it. I worry, actually, that this is going to become a bigger problem, and that we will see stories, Ebola crisis permitting, back on the front pages of the papers before too long. This is, I would argue, the gravest crisis Europe has faced since World War II. This is the first annexation by a European country of another since World War II. This, I think, has presented the gravest crisis between Russia, the successor to the Soviet Union, and the West since the Cuban Missile Crisis. I really can't understate the significance of what's happening here. And I think there has been too much complacency in the West about what is at stake. Ukraine, after all, is a country of 46 million people that last year, even under a pretty rotten, corrupt President Yanukovych, was trying to move closer toward Europe. And Ukraine, in my view, is a key part of the puzzle as we try to complete a vision of a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Ukraine is also important to Russia for its history, for its ties, for the ethnic issue, and President Putin decided he did not like the fact that Ukraine was moving closer toward Europe. But I would argue that this situation, this crisis, is important for other reasons too. It is important for nuclear weapons issues. In 1994, the United States and the UK, along with Russia and Ukraine, signed what's called the Budapest Memorandum, which pushed for Ukraine to relinquish its nuclear weapons, in exchange for which the United States, the UK, and Russia promised the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. That agreement, not a treaty, but that memorandum has been violated by one of the parties, Russia. And the concern I think people should have about that is that it reduces, if not eliminates, the incentive for countries either aspiring to have nuclear weapons or in possession of nuclear weapons to give them up. If this is what happens to Ukraine, having given up its nuclear weapons 20 years ago, then we don't want any part of it. So it's important in that respect. It's important because if Russia is allowed to get away with its invasion, aggression, assault, war, I would argue other countries are watching our reaction to this. China's watching. Iran is watching. So our reaction to this crisis, to the challenge that it poses, matters on a global scale, not just for how Russia will respond to our reaction. It's a threat to other countries in the region. My concern is that Putin, having annexed Crimea so easily in late February, early March of this year, got, to borrow a Stalinist phrase, dizzy with success, and decided to try his luck with eastern Ukraine and ran into two big problems in eastern Ukraine that he didn't confront in Crimea. The first was the Ukrainians decided to put up a fight. The second was there wasn't popular local support for what Russia was trying to do in eastern parts of Ukraine compared to the relative support, I don't want to exaggerate it, relative support in Crimea. But other countries in the region are very nervous. We were just talking about the Baltic states. I was in Tallinn 2 weeks ago, and the Estonians are very nervous. You have to remember that 2 days after President Obama visited Estonia, right before the NATO summit, and gave an excellent speech, I think, gave some strong reassurances to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, members of NATO, that the United States would view an attack or a threat against them as an attack against us. It would invoke Article 5. 2 days after President Obama's visit, an Estonian investigative official was kidnapped from Estonian territory by Russian forces and is still sitting in Moscow's Lefortovo prison. That was a clear signal to us. If you think NATO provides you security and guarantees, well, we, Russia, will tell you otherwise. Estonia and Latvia each have roughly 25% of their population is ethnic Russian. Lithuania has a smaller percentage of its population. The concern in those two countries is that Russia, Putin, will use the problems problems I put in quotes of ethnic Russians is a pretext to stir up trouble in those countries. Not by sending tanks and soldiers across the border. I don't think Putin is that foolish. But by trying to stir up the locals. He did this in the lead up to Latvia's election that just took place this past weekend. Didn't do very well. I don't think Latvia is in the clear, though, because they tried it through elections, didn't work. They might try it through other means. Moldova, very nervous about what's happening. They have elections coming up as well in November, with the possibility, it pains me to say this, that the Communist Party may come back to power. And Moldova has the best government it's ever had, and yet I fear that it risks being out of business based on what the voters decide. The Russians are clearly trying to tip the playing field in favor of the communists. Kazakhstan, a country that is part of Putin's Eurasian Economic Union, along with Belarus, where Putin, rather foolishly, I would say, raised questions about the integrity of Kazakhstan as an independent state. And this got President Nazarbayev all worked up and has raised concerns in Kazakhstan, which along the northern part of Kazakhstan that borders Russia has a sizable ethnic Russian population. So in countries where there is a sizable ethnic Russian population, these countries are nervous. They're worried that the same pretext that Putin used in Ukraine will be used in their case. Again, not necessarily by sending tens or hundreds of tanks across the border, but by trying to stir up locals to cause problems and instability. And so all of these reasons, I would argue, are why the crisis between Russia and Ukraine is very, very important. And I also want to emphasize, it is a crisis between Russia and Ukraine. This is not a civil war. Ukraine was not a divided country, in my view, before events of this year. There are differences between East and West. There are differences between the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States. But Ukraine was not on the verge of splitting up. I think those who argue it has are exaggerating the situation. I was in Crimea in January 2010 to observe the presidential election, in which Yanukovych won in the second round in February 2010. People in Crimea at that time were not talking about leaving Ukraine. And Crimea is the only part of Ukraine where there is a majority ethnic Russian population. In the Donetsk region, in the Luhansk region, the population is not majority ethnic Russian. It's only that case in Crimea, but as I say, even there was not interest in splitting off from Ukraine. Certainly close ties with Russia. The Black Sea Fleet that Russia has is based in Sevastopol. But it is Russia, it is Putin, I would argue, that fomented a separatist movement in Ukraine that did not exist before. Ukraine also, by the way, had not experienced violence like it saw starting at the end of November last year up through February, in which more than 100 protesters were tragically killed. Bless you. And the situation, for the most part, has been peaceful in Ukraine. In 2004, when there was the Orange Revolution, where people protested then Prime Minister Yanukovych's efforts to steal the presidential election, there was zero violence. No one was injured, no one was killed. What happened starting with the protests last November was the first use of force by government forces against the protesters. And that, I would argue, was done certainly by Yanukovych, who deserves blame and responsibility, but also prompted by Putin. So what sparked the crisis? Let's go back. I mentioned the 2010 presidential election in Ukraine that brought Viktor Yanukovych to the presidency. The Yanukovych presidency, I think, was a total disaster. It became a thoroughly corrupt authoritarian regime. The previous government, by the way, the Viktor Yushchenko government, was also a disaster. The government that came to power after the Orange Revolution. There were expectations that Yushchenko would be the savior of Ukraine. He didn't even come close to meeting those expectations. He was voted out of office. He was badly defeated in the presidential election in 2010. And then Yanukovych won in an election that most observers deemed as free and fair. He came to power through a democratic process. But Yanukovych, if you recall, in April 2010, signed a deal with Putin to provide for 25 more years of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol in exchange for a reduced price for gas for Ukraine, which Russia provides to Ukraine. Increasingly, the Yanukovych regime engaged in massive corruption, including his older son, Alexander, who was a trained dentist, whose reported income increased in 1 year 18 times. He must have been doing a hell of a lot of fillings. And the corruption inside the Yanukovych circle reached such proportions that the oligarchs in Ukraine were getting fed up with him. And Yanukovych was losing support. And yet, oddly enough, Yanukovych had decided 2 years before to move ahead with agreements with the European Union that involve free trade and other kinds of economic improvements. And the European Union was prepared to sign these agreements at a summit in Vilnius last November. 2 weeks before, Yanukovych announced that he was reneging on these deals, was not going to sign them. And I think it's safe to assume that that was also done under pressure from Putin, who woke up and realized, I do not want Ukraine moving in this direction. And the people turned out immediately in the streets of Kiev and then elsewhere throughout the country to protest Yanukovych's decision. But the problem is that Russia under Putin views any efforts by neighboring states to move toward a more democratic society, to integrate more closely with the West and with Europe, as a threat. Any efforts to democratize these countries are viewed by Putin as a threat because the Putinist system in Russia by no means wants to move toward a more democratic system. It does not want to integrate more closely with Europe or the United States. It wants to continue what I would argue is one of the most corrupt regimes in the world. There have been estimates, they're out in the public now, but when I was in the government, that Putin himself was worth some $40 billion. Those estimates have only gone up in price. You must have good investors. And the level of corruption in Russia is staggering. Putin, I would argue, has become a hostage to his own system. He came back to the presidency in 2012 because he didn't trust Medvedev to oversee the system and to crack down if need be. He felt that only he was the one in a position to do so. And this is where, and there are others who have done work in this field, the connection between corruption and authoritarianism really come into play. The more corrupt a regime is, the more authoritarian it tends to become because it can't afford to give up power. If it does so, then the leaders of that regime may wind up in jail. And so overseeing this kind of regime meant that for Putin, any efforts to democratize, to westernize, were a threat if they were happening in the region. It's why in 2003 in Georgia with the Rose Revolution, in 2004 in Ukraine with the Orange Revolution, Putin got scared. He thought those color revolutions, as they became known, were going to Russia next. He also assumed that the United States was behind them. He thought Georgians, Ukrainians couldn't possibly be capable on their own of overthrowing the governments that were in place. They had to have been the work of the State Department, which, by the way, having worked at the State Department for 8 years, the State Department couldn't organize a protest on C Street, let alone a revolution in another country, with no disrespect to my State Department colleagues. But Putin felt that these movements were after him next. Things quieted down. The Yushchenko presidency didn't live up to the expectations, as I mentioned. But then the Arab world movements, the Arab region movements, renewed Putin's paranoia, renewed his concern, and particularly Libya, where he felt that Medvedev made a mistake in abstaining in the UN Security Council for the intervention in Libya. And it's why I would argue one of the reasons Putin has drawn the line, if you will, in Syria, where he decided, I do not want Bashar al-Assad to fall, a like-minded leader. This kind of regime change, even from the Middle East, is not good for my own hold on power. Putin, I would argue, combines some very dangerous characteristics. He is both an arrogant, assertive, cocky, self-confident leader, but he's also very paranoid, insecure, and hypersensitive. And that is a bad combination because he will act in ways that we don't necessarily find rational in order to stay in power. And so when Yanukovych decided not to move forward with the EU agreements, again under Russian pressure, Putin then felt Yanukovych needed to crack down and clear the square. So for several months, the protests continued. More and more people came out. But then in February, Putin renewed his offer of $15 billion to Yanukovych as a bailout, but in exchange for which Yanukovych had to clear the square. Putin announced the $15 billion loan resumption on Monday. Tuesday is when the terrible violence broke out in Kiev. And more than 100 people were killed. And for weeks after that, by the way, if any of you have been to Kiev, I was there in April, the protesters were still there, the encampments were still there. They're now clear, but there are still monuments to the people who lost their lives in downtown Kiev. And then very quickly that week in February, developments picked up speed. You had several EU foreign ministers go to Kiev to try to negotiate an agreement with Yanukovych and the opposition. That lasted not even a day, and it reached a point where Yanukovych fled from power. He went to Russia and was no longer president. The Ukrainian parliament then removed him, and you had a new interim government come in to Ukraine. That terrified Putin. Again, he felt, I can't let this stand. If this can happen in Ukraine, he worried it might happen in Russia. And again, he blamed the US and the State Department because Ukrainians couldn't possibly have been capable of this kind of power and this kind of movement on their own. So he very quickly dusted off a contingency plan, Crimea, where he ordered forces into Crimea. There already had been forces in Crimea from the Black Sea Fleet base, and in record time, I mean, it was dizzying how fast this happened. Crimea held a referendum and was annexed by Russia several days later. Just like that, Crimea was taken from Ukraine. It was a bloodless event for the most part. I think there were 2 people who lost their lives. And that was so successful, it's so fast, that Putin said, let's try eastern Ukraine. Let's move into Donetsk, Luhansk, maybe even Kharkiv. And that's when you saw more Russian forces, little green men as they were called. Because remember, in Crimea, there were Russian forces going around without any identifying insignia who were behind this movement. Putin, of course, denied that there were any Russians playing a role in Crimea, though he did later acknowledge that there were Russian forces that were there. Same phenomenon happens in eastern Ukraine. The problem there, as I said before, is he ran into Ukrainian military resistance and a lack of support in the eastern part of Ukraine. So we have to keep in mind where Putin comes from. He came up through the ranks, not the highest ranks, of the KGB. He was the head of the FSB, the successor agency of the KGB. He became prime minister in 1999 after there were 4 suspicious bombings that killed 300 people in Russia. There was a 5th bomb, by the way, that didn't go off that probably raised more questions than the 4 bombs that went off. And Putin came to power vowing to suppress a so-called separatist Chechen movement. And he did so in a rather brutal, indiscriminate way. But that was very popular with Russians. After the years of doddering, drunken Boris Yeltsin, they finally saw a young, sober guy, Vladimir Putin, who would restore Russia to its greatness and restore order to the country. And Putin became president when Yeltsin resigned at the end of 1999 through an election in 2000. One of the things that Putin did early on was to take over nationwide TV. 2000 and 2001, he took away the TV channels from Gusinsky and Berezovsky. And I mention this because it was both a devious but brilliant move on Putin's part. Most Russians get their news and information through TV. And by maintaining control over these networks, Putin was then able to control the messaging and the news and information that Russians would get. And that has become very useful for him over the many years that he's been in power. In 2003, October 2003, almost 11 years ago, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the richest Russian, was arrested and thrown in jail. Freedom House hosted Khodorkovsky last week at our annual dinner, and Khodorkovsky spoke about the mistakes he thinks Putin has made since he's been in power. By going after Khodorkovsky, Putin didn't have to go after all the oligarchs. By going after the biggest fish in the pond, all the other fish in the pond got the message. And none of them challenged Putin like Khodorkovsky challenged Putin. And Khodorkovsky paid a major price for it. The Ukraine situation, though, threatened all of this. And so Putin decided to act. What to do about it? Mindful of the time and the interest to hear and get into a discussion. I think the West has been too slow and too reactive and has not done enough. If you look at Western policy toward Russia from February of this year even to where it is now, there has been a sea change. Not for the better. Serious sanctions have been imposed against Russia, against individuals in Russia, against people in Ukraine who are part of this whole crisis. I would say that we have been too slow with the sanctions, and we have not hit enough targets. And we've hit a lot. I'll give you one specific example. Gazprom, which is the largest gas company in Russia, has not been sanctioned. And yet it's Gazprom that actually cut off gas to Ukraine earlier this year. No one wants to touch it, particularly in Europe, because the Europeans are very dependent on Gazprom for their gas. About a quarter of Europe's energy comes from Russia. The United States, on the other hand, I would argue, has no dependency on Gazprom and should be sanctioning Gazprom, and yet hasn't done so. I think that's been a major mistake. We have done sanctions in rounds, and it's been predicated on Russian action. What that has done is it has enabled Putin to set the agenda, and we have been in reacting mode. I think we should have been much more proactive in trying to preempt further Russian aggression by hitting with much harder sanctions early on in this process. We started with sanctions against Russia's invasion of Crimea. The Crimean situation hasn't gotten any better. In fact, Freedom House, along with the Atlantic Council in Washington, will be producing a special report, I hope later this month, on the human rights situation in Crimea. The sanctions that have been imposed since March have been for what Russia's done in other parts of Ukraine. I think we haven't done enough, and I hope we do more. Second, we need to be clear in our language about what's happened. I think we have been far too hesitant to describe what Russia's done as an invasion. It has been an invasion. When you send forces across a border, even if it's not hundreds of thousands, that's an invasion. They're not welcome. The Ukrainians did not invite them in. Incursion, all these other nouns don't cut it. It's an invasion. And we're hesitant to call it an invasion, even though there's no legal trigger, because we fear that if we do so, it will then make it incumbent upon us to respond in some fashion. It's also not a civil war, and we need to be clear about that, and I talked about that earlier. We also need to realize that because of the nature of the Putin regime, our values are in totally opposite directions. And in fact, I would argue the way a regime treats its own people is often indicative of how it behaves in foreign policy and how it treats others. And the Putin regime shows zero interest in respecting the human rights of Russians inside Russia. And that's what makes hollow Putin's claims of concern for ethnic Russians inside Ukraine. He doesn't care about the Russians inside his own country. Why would he care about Russians inside Ukraine? We've seen the worst crackdown in human rights in Russia since the breakup of the Soviet Union. That the situation is getting worse by the day. People are leaving Russia. Russia has the unfortunate claim to having the most asylum seekers leaving Russia next to Syria, second highest in the world. Polls show that Russians, particularly young educated Russians, if they could, would leave. For many reasons. It's not the current crisis necessarily. It's for corruption, it's for opportunities elsewhere. And yet, what has Putin been doing in response to Western actions? He closed down an exchange program that has been, I think, a very successful one, the FLEX program, Future Leaders Exchange Program. In 2012, after the U.S. Congress passed Magnitsky legislation that imposes a visa ban and asset freeze on Russian officials involved in gross human rights abuses, and Freedom House and I played an active role in pushing that legislation. What did Putin do? He banned the adoption of Russian orphans by American citizens. And what else has he done? He's banned the import of food from countries that have imposed sanctions on Russia. So what is his reaction? He punishes Russians even more, even though the reaction has been positive. I would argue it's a shallow level of support in Russia, particularly as Russians discover they can't buy the stuff they were used to buy. Their sons and daughters can't engage in these exchange programs. And as Russian orphans don't find homes in Russian families and instead are left in institutions that certainly don't meet very high standards. We need to be clear about all of this. And we also need to understand, and this is the first time I've mentioned it here, and people sadly have forgotten it, the Malaysian airline incident, in which 298 people were murdered. And I do use that verb consciously. And yet, people don't talk about it anymore. I was in Europe over the weekend, in Sweden. It hardly came up. I imagine if I were in Amsterdam or The Hague, it probably would. But it was the reaction to the shoot-down that I think was as telling about the Putin regime as the actual shoot-down itself. When you have forces that aim at planes, you're probably going to make a mistake sooner or later. And they did. But it was the reaction to it. Putin had an opportunity to disown the forces he had sent to Ukraine. And instead, what was his comment? It's Ukraine's responsibility because it happened over Ukrainian territory. He showed an utter callousness, indifference, a cold-bloodedness that I think left most people very shaken. And it actually produced a reaction in Germany in particular, where the German business community had not supported sanctions. They switched and they came around and supported tougher sanctions. And yet, people don't talk about it anymore. And I think that's a major mistake. I think we need to provide military assistance to Ukraine, not U.S. soldiers on the ground. But the Ukrainians have asked for anti-tank weapons, anti-aircraft weapons. I think that if NATO had flown in a dozen planes in July or August to Kiev, I think Putin would have had a heart attack. He does not want a confrontation with NATO, even though he wants to toy with NATO. But the fact that we were clear in what we would not do gave Putin a green light. The Washington Post had a great phrase to describe President Obama's comments about what he would not do, gratuitous clarity. We have been far too clear in telling Putin what we will not do. We have telegraphed our limits. I would much rather have Putin wondering, what might the U.S. do if I do X, Y, or Z? And instead we keep saying to him what we won't do, and I think that's been a major mistake. President Poroshenko was in Washington in the middle of September, spoke before a joint session of Congress, asked for military assistance in the morning, got a resounding reception from the Congress, went to the White House that afternoon and got a lecture from the president. The president said to him, "Don't try to box me in." I was in Ukraine 3 days after Poroshenko's visit, and senior Ukrainian officials were asking me, did Poroshenko make a mistake, in asking for that? And I said, no. You could question whether Poroshenko should have gone to Washington to be publicly rebuffed in his request for military assistance. But once there, he had to ask for military assistance before the Congress. Otherwise, the Congress would lose interest in Ukraine. As a result of his request before the joint session of Congress, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that afternoon passed unanimously, 18-0, a legislation calling for military assistance to Ukraine as well as sanctions against other Russian entities, including Gazprom. And I think that was as a result of his speech. We need to do a better job of beefing up neighbors, although I think NATO has done a good job of that with NATO member states such as the Baltics and Poland. But we need to do even more, and we shouldn't tie ourselves into knots about whether the forces we're stationing in the Baltics are permanent or temporary. Russia's ripped up all the agreements we've had, including the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act. We shouldn't tie ourselves into knots by worrying about certain terminology. We are not in a Cold War, again, per se, because we don't quite have the ideological grounding for it. But we certainly are at odds, to say the least. And I would argue Russia has posed a new threat to us, to its neighbors, to NATO, to our interest in the region. There is growing anti-Americanism in Russia. The standing of the United States in Russia is really at an all-time low since the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm deeply worried about that. And this is because of the constant Kremlin propaganda that Russians have fed that the United States is its biggest threat, which is nonsense. That NATO enlargement is the biggest threat. There, too, I would disagree. If you look at the facts, Russia's most secure, stable borders are with countries that are either in NATO and or the EU. Russia, in fact, has nothing to be worried about from Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania or even Finland, which is not in NATO but is in the EU. Where Russia does have threats and concerns is in the south, including from Iran or from China. And yet Russia never identifies Iran and China as threats. It always identifies us as the threat. And we always say, well, they've said it before, or let's not pay too much attention to that. We always fluff it off. I think we have to come to grips with the fact that the Putin regime depends on painting us as the enemy, as the demon, as the one behind all of these world movements. And that, I think, is a major problem. And I'll wrap up by saying that we need to do two things. One is we can't forget Crimea. This crisis started by Russia's takeover of Crimea. And so even if Russia lives up to a ceasefire deal that was announced on September 5th, which includes a pullback of its forces, which is not happening, or an end to the fighting, which is not happening, we can't forget Crimea. Crimea belongs to Ukraine. It was given to Ukraine when the Soviet Union still existed by Khrushchev in 1954, and Russia shouldn't be questioning the boundaries in Europe in 2014. Last point is we have to give meaning to the word unacceptable. If we say something is unacceptable, what are we going to do about it so as not to accept it, so as not to return to business as usual? If we say Putin's treatment of Russians inside Russia is unacceptable, then we should support and pass the Magnitsky legislation to try to at least target sanctions against Russians involved in gross human rights abuses. If we say Russia's invasion and annexation of parts of Ukraine are unacceptable, what are we going to do about it? We've done sanctions. We should be doing more. We have to give meaning to the word unacceptable, because every time a Western leader says, and this is true not just about Russia, about problems anywhere, every time we say something's unacceptable, but we go about business as usual, we cheapen the currency of what we stand for. And our principles, our positions on human rights, support for democracy, support for freedom, are why people want to join NATO, the EU, why they constantly turn to the United States to stand with them in solidarity during difficult times. I would argue we are facing, with all the other problems that you mentioned, Ebola, the Middle East, we are facing one of the toughest times that I can remember. And yet, this is in Europe, with NATO member states on the borders, with Article 5 guarantees that involve the United States. This is a major crisis that is not over yet. And I am not here to sound like I miss the Cold War days. I don't. And my last point, as you mentioned, I worked at the Carnegie Endowment in the 1990s. We set up the Carnegie Moscow Center to try to promote greater understanding between Russia and the United States. I worked there for 5.5 years in Washington doing this. So I've had a long-standing interest in trying to promote better ties. My conclusion is that despite our efforts, and we have not been perfect, but despite our best efforts, the nature of the Putin regime prevents better ties between Russia and the United States. And I think it's time that we come to grips and realize that. Thank you.
Terrific comments. And mindful of the time, I will keep my comments very, very brief so we can open it up to discussion. But I do want to lay out a couple of issues because areas of disagreement and of possible disagreement. Areas of agreement, the big ones. One, so far Russia has not challenged NATO directly. I think there's a big difference between Ukraine and the Baltics, which are NATO members. And as you mentioned in your comments, he wants to needle, I think is the way you put it. He wants to needle, but he doesn't want to hit directly, at least not yet. I agree that if he decided to hit, if Russia decided to take stronger action in the Balkans, that would be a much more serious problem, but he's not there yet. I also agree with your general description. The portrait you paint of Vladimir Putin is arrogant and paranoid and doing things to seize and hold power in Russia which look irrational to us, right? I actually agree with that summation, but it's not just that they look irrational, they are irrational, right? Vladimir Putin is very, very good at seizing and holding power. He's proven that for a long, long time now. But the things that make you good at being a dictator don't necessarily make you good as a strategist abroad. Right? And while he's proven enormously capable at consolidating his rule in Russia, I think he's proven totally incompetent as a strategist abroad. In fact, his actions in Ukraine beginning almost a year ago have been catastrophic for Russia. Right? In terms of the Russian economy and Russian strategic plans, they've been a total disaster. Right? The Russian stock market is at a 6-month low. Its currency is totally collapsing. They're facing huge capital flight. All of Putin's dreams of this big military modernization program, he was going to spend over $700 billion bringing back the Soviet army, that's all going out the window real fast. Right? He is crippling his own country. And he's doing it as a commodities exporter. Right? Russia gains something on the order of 70% of its revenue from oil and gas sales. Right? That's not a pathway to great power status. That's not how to bring back the old Soviet Union. Right? And he's compounding that inherent vulnerability through these blunders. What does that mean in terms of your comments? I think that while Vladimir Putin has caused a considerable amount of problems on his periphery, I don't think the crisis is that important for the United States. Right? Simply judging the balance of capabilities and the relative balance of power tells me, as an American, that this is not quite that large a problem. If you just weigh, for instance, relative military spending, the balance is on the order of 60 billion, for Russia, and 1.2 trillion for the combined members of NATO. It's just completely lopsided, right? And there's a danger, I think, in exaggerating the Russian threat for a country which is a little bit better militarily than it was 10 years ago, but which is not, it's still nowhere near what Europe and the United States can put against it. And it has an economy which is in free fall. So I don't know that the problem is that big right now. I also disagree, and this is something maybe we can take up, that the world is watching the American response. I don't think that America's reputation is quite so fragile. There is this argument, this very intuitive argument that you make, that the world needs to see that America is strong and it's responding with vigor, or else it will doubt American resolve and other bad actors will act in bad ways. I don't think that the rest of the world keeps a ledger sheet of what the United States does every day. I think they're primarily egotistic. They focus on their own behavior. All states are egotists. They focus on their own behavior. They don't constantly keep track of others in this way. And the other point is the United States has demonstrated a huge amount of energy and vigor over the last 25 years. Right? I was sketching down the number of places where we've used military force since 1989. Panama, Iraq, Somalia, Bosnia, Yemen, Sudan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Libya, and now Syria. If reputation was a function of strength, we should have bought something for all of that military activism. Right? We should have bought some street cred for all of that work. So I'm not terribly concerned that because our sanctions against Russia weren't strong enough, fast enough, that the rest of the world is going to think we're weak and bad actors are going to behave badly. And obviously you disagree, and we should talk about this more. What would be a problem? What would be a serious problem? I think that the real crisis, if there's going to be a crisis, will happen if Russia acts against one of the Baltic states. These are NATO allies, right? At this point, the United States would have a real problem because we do have NATO obligations under Article 5. And the president recently delivered a very, very powerful speech in Estonia declaring that this was our red line. Right? We might like to have stronger rhetoric in support of Ukraine, but I don't think anybody is going to take that seriously because I think that most people watching understand that the balance of interests in Ukraine are completely one-sided. Russia cares a lot more about the Ukraine than we do, right? And it always will. It's right in its neighborhood. It has huge historical and cultural connections to the place, and we don't, nor is it our allies. So even if an American president really took a firmer rhetorical line, I don't know that anybody would take that seriously. It would be different if Russia tries to repeat what it's done in Ukraine in a place like Latvia or Estonia, where there are NATO obligations at stake. And at that point, there will be a real reckoning. And people really will have to think, how important is NATO to us? Right? Do we really want to have this large alliance kept intact at the risk of having a serious conflict with Russia? So hopefully that laid out at least some areas of disagreement. And why don't we just throw it open to questions? You all right with that?
Sure, absolutely.
Please. Jean, please. Jean Cox.
Well, I thought Dr. Rovner's...
Take up microphones.
Oh, there is a mic coming around.
I have a pretty loud voice, but Josh, your comment about street cred, I just wondered if you could address that because I tend to feel like you're only as credible as your last speech on unacceptable behavior. And time and again with this administration, we see them threaten or talk tough with no action. So my question is, how emboldened has Russia become with this administration? And if there's a change in administration to a more hawkish administration, would that make a difference immediately?
Do you want to take a couple, or should you want me to respond?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Let me answer it two ways. One is, as Josh mentioned, I served in the Bush administration. And Russia took action against two countries when we were in office. 2007, which no one remembers, cyber attack against Estonia. And since then, NATO has beefed up its response and security for cyber. In fact, Estonia hosts a cybersecurity center. 2008 was Georgia. I don't want to sit here and give you the impression that the Bush administration response to Georgia was the right one and the Obama administration response to Ukraine was the wrong one. We didn't do anything, frankly, about Georgia. We did bring back Georgian troops who were in Iraq. Admiral Mullen got on the phone to his Russian counterpart and said, "We're bringing them back, don't touch them or our plane." The fighting ended. I think it probably was ending anyway, but there was a little muscle flexing. But that was it. We didn't impose any sanctions. We didn't do anything. We left office. The Obama administration came in with a reset. I think Putin has a very low opinion of President Obama. He views him as very weak. And this is where I think I agree with you. It's sort of the last speech or last action of policy, and it's Syria. The red line that the president drew on Syria, and then the decision not to use force. Whatever you think about whether that was the right or wrong thing, and then we sort of open the door for Putin to come in and save the day on chemical weapons, I think that only bolstered Putin's view that he could have his way. And the reason I think that's important about credibility is he then thinks, well, I might be able to get away with Ukraine, or I might be able to get away with Moldova. Moldova's not a member of NATO either. And Russia already has some troops on the Transnistrian part of Moldova, so stirring up trouble in Moldova is fairly easy. I do think the credibility issue is important. I by no means want to ascribe all the world's problems right now to the president. A lot of these things would be happening whether he were in office, whether he's in office or someone else were in office. But I do think that there is a sense among the Putins of the world that we have disengaged and we're not as confident, maybe, if you will, as we should be in light of the current challenges we're facing in the world. So I think we probably do have we can agree to disagree on this, but I think it is important. And you look at the Chinese, who, and we were talking about this earlier, some pretty serious muscle flexing in the region. And I don't want to say that how we react to the Russian invasion of Ukraine will determine what the Chinese will do in the South China Sea region, but it's not irrelevant, I would say.
In the back, please.
About 6 or 7 years ago, we published a book at Penn State Press by a political scientist from Washington University, the title of which was Out of Order. And it was based on a survey of attitudes of Soviet citizens. And the upshot of it was to show that what really happened in Russia to get the populace behind Putin was that previously things just didn't work. And so that's what the title meant. Basic things like plumbing broke down and the infrastructure in general was crumbling. And so Putin came along and turned things around. And this made people's fascination with democracy kind of irrelevant. And so it turned out that what really is important to the Russian people is very pragmatic things, how things work. If they work in order rather than out of order, then the leader is going to get support. So this raises the question of, well, as Josh said, things are now going in the other direction in Russia. Eventually the average Russian citizen is going to be impacted in ways that pragmatically are harmful to the individual citizen. So isn't this over time going to make the sanctions effective? It may take a while, but it suggests that Putin's basic kind of support, which is not ideological at all, it's basically pragmatic, is going to erode. Do you agree with that?
Here I think Josh and I are in agreement. I think Putin has kind of screwed himself with all of this, and the economy is in trouble. Sanctions have a lot to do with it, but the economy was already going into trouble before this whole crisis emerged. And part of that is the continued enormous dependence on export of natural resources. 50% of Russia's budget comes from energy exports, the revenues. And, if you remember Medvedev, that brief time he was president, talked about modernization. Putin does not use the word. Skolkovo, remember everyone got excited about Skolkovo, this new IT sector. It's a building. There's nothing there. But your point, I think, is a very important one, because the 1990s for Russians were a terribly difficult period. They lost savings, they lost jobs, they lost a sense that Russia really was a world power. And I think we in the United States made an enormous mistake, a number of mistakes, but one of them was to describe the 1990s in Russia as a time of democracy. It wasn't. It was a time of freedom compared to the Soviet Union because the state collapsed. And the state simply didn't have the means by which to control society as it did during the days of the USSR. But that was a lack of ability rather than a conscious decision to democratize the country. Yeltsin stole the election, or there was serious fraud in 96. Yeltsin invaded Chechnya in 94, the shelling of the parliament in 93. There's a long corruption, the loans for shares deal, long list of things one could cite that completely discredits the notion that this was a time of market reform and democratization in the 90s. And yet when we describe it that way to Russians, they say, I don't want any of that. But the other point I just want to pick up on that you made about Putin, let's not forget the price of oil, because the price of oil is what gave Putin the boost that he needed. If oil had shot up the way it did while Yeltsin was still president, I bet you Yeltsin's numbers would have gone up, not to Putin's levels. And that had nothing to do with Putin. So outside forces had an enormous impact on Putin's popularity because it did give the Russian economy the boost it needed to recover from a very difficult time in the 1990s. Oil is now, 90?
90.
Every dollar it drops takes away $1.3 billion from Russia's GDP.
That's right.
And the budget, I think, is contingent on 105.
Was their base. Well, there was 105, now it's down to 100.
Now to 100. So this is getting their attention. And frankly, if we started exporting, he's screwed. So I hope we start doing it sooner rather than later.
Any other questions?
Jumping.
Well, I'm not sure where to start in my questions, but
Just keep circling around.
I will, it's very interesting to me listening to this because it seems to be an objective lesson in the difference that exists in American foreign policy. I'm tempted to say Bush versus Bush here, if you see where I'm going.
Mm-hmm.
Because, on one hand, we've got Bush 1, I think a thoroughly Jim Baker sort of realpolitik view of the world, which is, let's not push too far too fast and end up making matters much worse. I think that's where Josh is in his assessment situation, and you sound very much like Bush 2 to me, which is a much more idealistic, dare I say, neo-Wilsonian sort of view of the world, which is it's America's responsibility to promote democracy and freedom. So I guess my question is there any way to square that circle? Can we get Rovner and Kramer, Bush 1 and Bush 2, on the same page here tonight?
Well, I hope so, because we're having dinner later.
I'm sorry that my colleague, Dan Orlovsky, who's the great Russian historian here at SMU, had to leave early because we're having another lecture tonight on World War I and the Eastern Front, which is happening up the campus here a ways. But I remember taking my Russian history classes years ago, and there was a fellow who taught it who had written a famous book called The Great Friendship, which was about the construction of Greater Russia, which came to be eventually the Soviet Union. So, and I think Professor Zimakova and others are here tonight that might want to weigh in on this. What is Russia? What is Russia today? And clearly for Putin, there is a romantic, idealized vision of Russia and Greater Russia. I think we have other Russians with us tonight, which raises the question of, what's motivating Putin? And I'll conclude by simply saying, I think it's domestic politics. I mean, this is really, really boosting his political support in the short term. And no matter what kind of strategist he is, I mean, how can you resist doing something that's going to give you that kind of political boost or that kind of political support? So I'll stop there.
Well, a couple of things there, but I'll try to be brief. Putin's numbers were dropping at the beginning of this year, and still pretty good by Western political leaders' standards.
Better than Obama's.
Better than Obama's, for sure. But I think he was getting worried. And it gets at your question about what motivates him. What motivates him is staying in power.
Yeah.
That's his number one objective is staying in power. His number two objective is staying in power, and his number three objective is the same as 1 and 2. And again, it comes to the issue of corruption and authoritarianism. It's a thoroughly rotten, corrupt regime, and it's a rotting regime. And the more corrupt it becomes, the more authoritarian it's going to become. And staying in power is what he is focused on. So watching what happened in Ukraine, in his mind, was a threat to his hold on power. He had to try to stop it, reverse it, undo it. I actually don't believe Putin's goal is to restore the Soviet Union. I think those who argue that give him too much credit for having a vision that isn't there. I think his vision is actually much more negative and destructive for two reasons. One, he's actually repelling his neighbors, not drawing them in. He's terrifying them. None of them, even Belarus, doesn't want the part of Putin. But secondly, the destructive, negative part is he just wants to destabilize Ukraine. He wants to make Ukraine ugly and unattractive so that the EU in particular and the West as a whole lose interest. So that Ukraine is then left to fend with Russia. What a terribly self-destructive strategy. Obviously, a prosperous Ukraine, democratic Ukraine, a Ukraine that has good relations with the West as well as with Russia, is really in Russia's interest. But this is where I think we run into a problem, and it gets at your point about irrationality. Putin often is driven by personal corrupt interests, not by national interests. It is not in Russia's national interest to be in the current situation that they're in.
So there we have an agreement.
Absolutely. No, I think we're in violent agreement, actually, on that. So I think he pursues a terribly damaging strategy that in the short term may look good. But I agree. I think he's acting out of weakness. But again, weakness and strength are relative. Weak compared to whom? Compared to Western leaders, it comes back to the question there. Compared to some leaders in the West, I think he feels like he's on top of the world.
Well, he might feel that way, but he's wrong. I mean, he's just demonstrably wrong. This is, as you said, everything he's done has been incredibly self-destructive. Like, his moves in the last year have basically imploded the Russian economy, have shattered their plans for military growth and modernization, have breathed new life into NATO, and have freaked out all the neighbors who are now balancing against him. Right? So if you're thinking of a recipe for eroding your own national power, I can't think of a better mix. And that's what leads me to believe that this is not the sort of huge crisis that we think it is. Now, I totally agree that it's terrible for Ukraine. It's absolutely atrocious for Ukraine. Right? It's not good news. Now, the question is, if you think that we have a moral obligation to assist the Ukrainians, right, rather than a strategic imperative to assist the Ukrainians, then you start to have to ask the questions, are we going to do more harm than good by seriously trying to get involved? Right? I don't know exactly how much money it will take to rebuild the Ukrainian economy. I know the Ukrainian economy is a basket case. I know Ukrainian politics are totally dysfunctional. I know that from our recent experience trying to do nation building elsewhere, this is really, really hard. And we would be doing it right in the backyard of Russia, who will be doing everything in its power to undermine our efforts. So even if you think there's a moral obligation there, best of luck. I mean, this might be a bridge too far, given our own interest and given our own experience.
Just two quick points if I can. I know others want to jump in. Yeah, I largely agree with you, Josh, but Putin's numbers are still very high. And those popularity ratings may feed more of this kind of irrational behavior. I actually think on Ukraine we have both a moral and a strategic imperative. We can't help everyone everywhere. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't help anyone anywhere. Did I get that right? Okay. So whenever I try those phrases, I often get them mixed up.
We'll fix the tape later.
Right. But what the demonstrators turned out for in November was an end to corruption and an end to authoritarianism, more democracy, rule of law, closer ties to the West. I think we have an obligation to try to be helpful to that kind of movement. And I agree that the current situation is not great. And we can't save Ukraine more than Ukrainians can save Ukraine. But I do think we have both goals in mind, or should.
Please.
If I could. I wanted to get back to exactly what Josh was referring to, which is the Ukraine and the way the Ukraine is run as an economy. It has been a basket case ever since 1990, and we've had regime after regime, the creation of the oligarchs and massive corruption, never anything related to the rule of law or the creation of the institutions. Forget about democracy. The institutions that will lead to economic development. If you do it in the West, it will go to the East. But if you don't start it in the West, it will never get anywhere. And the other thing I wanted to take exception with Josh was that you mentioned all the great things that the U.S. has done. Well, other than a great victory in Grenada, we really haven't been very successful in many of the things that we've done. So, you can argue a lot of those things back and forth.
You get no argument from me. My point was not that these were good decisions or that these were wars well fought. My simple point was if our reputation rests on displays of strength, we ought to have a really, really strong reputation by now because we use strength all the time.
Just on your point about corruption, Freedom House did special reports on Ukraine in 2011 and 2012. First year, the title was Sounding the Alarm. Second year was Sounding the Alarm Round 2. We decided not to do one in 2013. It's The Boy Cries Wolf. But we identified corruption is the main threat to Ukraine. More than Russia. In the corruption under Yushchenko, the corruption under Yanukovych, particularly in the energy sector, where Russia is able to insinuate itself, is a cancer for Ukraine. There's no doubt about it. And it's why there is growing frustration with the current Ukrainian leadership, a sense that they are not doing enough to reform and to address the problem of corruption. One of the most disturbing things early on under Poroshenko, before he was even elected president, he traveled at least twice to Vienna to meet with one of the Ukrainian oligarchs, Dmitry Firtash, who was head of a thoroughly rotten, corrupt energy middleman company, Rosukrenergo. And Firtash was detained by Austrian authorities at U.S. request. We have an investigation out into him. Poroshenko had to go to Vienna to get Firtash's support for the Udar party, which involves Vitaly Klitschko. The very idea that Poroshenko, himself a billionaire, had to go to Vienna to get Firtash's blessing was a really bad step. And it suggests that some of the people that all those protesters wanted out were still serious players, and that's unfortunate.
Well, Pinchuk and all the rest of them.
I'm sorry?
Pinchuk and all the rest of them.
Yeah. Akhmetov.
They're still there?
Kolomoisky is one of the most powerful people in Ukraine. Kolomoisky, who's now the regional head of Dnipropetrovsk, has actually, in some ways, done a service to his country by beefing up security in that region, so you haven't seen the problems in Donetsk and Luhansk there, but he's become sort of his own boss, and that's not a good sign. He was a strong supporter of Yanukovych.
Nobody pays for natural gas, and they don't have enough money to pay the market price for that.
Ukraine is so inefficient in its use of energy, and I'm going to get this wrong, but so Germany has, almost twice the population, and yet Ukraine uses, I think it's 6 times the amount of energy as Germany. People have, this is true in Russia too, but in Ukraine, people have their windows wide open in the middle of winter while the heat is blasting. They have to come up with more incentives to use energy efficiently.
We have 2 questions in the same row.
Mr. Kramer, you said a few things that I thought were pretty interesting.
Just a few.
But you seem really critical of Putin, and he probably deserves the criticism. So I don't have any problem with that. But the way you describe what you're critical of him about seems pretty consistent with a lot of U.S. foreign policy in the past, like the adventurism and wanting more control and hegemonic power and stuff like that. So if it's wrong for him, my question is, why isn't it wrong for us? If it's good for us, why isn't it good for him? The second thing is, the way you described what happened with Crimea, you justified that it should stay with Ukraine. I think I may have misunderstood you, but you said it should really stay with Ukraine because it was a gift from the former Russia to Ukraine. But it's not just a country, it's a country of people. And from what I understand, they had some kind of election, and they voted to go with Russia. So, but you talk about it like a country can just give a bunch of people to another country, and that seems to go against your current vision of freedom and democracy and things like that, because they had a vote. So I'd just like...
Sure. I'll start with the second. On Crimea, Khrushchev gave it to Ukraine, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which is part of the USSR in 1954. When the Soviet Union broke up, all the leaders agreed to abide by the boundaries and sovereignty and territorial integrity that existed at that time. So there was no acceptance of revisiting, reopening the boundaries that occurred. So in 1991, Crimea was part of Ukraine. This is now the first time that Russia is trying to reclaim it. Putin has said it was a mistake on Khrushchev's part. Khrushchev made a lot of mistakes. What other mistakes is Putin going to revisit? This one involves another country. If he wants to revisit mistakes Khrushchev made inside Russia, that's one thing. But to revisit mistakes he claims Khrushchev made with Ukraine, that's an invasion. It's a war. As for the referendum, it was announced 2 weeks before it was held. There is absolutely zero way you can have a credible referendum in such a short period of time. The way that Russia did it, it rammed this through. You had guys with guns all throughout the region, and so people knew better than to vote against it. As I said before, Crimea is the only part of Ukraine where there's a majority ethnic Russian population. There were surveys done before the referendum by groups like the International Republican Institute and others that did not show support, majority support in Crimea for either independence or annexation. So this was all a Russian ginned up operation. And it's why no one has recognized it, including, by the way, nobody in the former Soviet Union. Lukashenko hasn't recognized it. Kazakhstan hasn't recognized it. None of them has recognized it. On the Putin versus the U.S., and we could get into a very lengthy debate about what we've done over the years. Whether done badly or well, we have not gone in and annexed another country or part of another country. We have tried to liberate countries. We've tried to deal with...
Since the Mexican-American War.
Right. Yes. I'm talking about post-Cold War or post-war era.
Did we liberate Hawaii?
I'm talking post-war.
Oh.
Post-World War II.
World War II.
Well, that's true. Whether one likes it or not, what we've tried to do is to deal with what we perceive, often with allies, in some cases with UN Security Council approval, threats to our allies, to freedom elsewhere. What Putin's trying to do is impose his system on other countries. And that's what he's trying to do in the case of Ukraine, or destabilize it. So I do think that for all of our faults and mistakes and shortcomings, we are a rule of law based society. We're a democracy. Whereas Russia is not based in rule of law at all and is a corrupt authoritarian regime that is trying to impose itself on others. So I think you could certainly have a healthy debate discussion about what we've done over the years, but we're talking about comparing apples and oranges.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Sorry, I'll try to be brief in my answers.
I recently returned from Europe and Germany in particular, and the Germans are quite concerned that this winter, with the Russians holding the handle on the gas line to keep them warm this winter, it's rather difficult for them, especially considering the problems they've had in the European economy in the last couple of years, for us to expect them to be as hard on Russia as we would like them to be? And how do you get a real reaction, a real result from Russia when you can't have the kind of unanimity in the West that would provide that kind of result?
The Malaysian airliner did produce it.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's no doubt that the last round of sanctions came as a result of that Malaysian shoot down. Your point about energy is absolutely right. The Germans have been enablers, though, of the Putin regime. The Nord Stream pipeline, which Gerhard Schroeder has been part of, they bought him. He's part of the corruption problem. And Merkel's decision on nuclear energy also has increased Germany's dependency on Russian energy exports. But you've got some countries that are 100% dependent on Russia, who have become apologists for Putin, and yet you do have some countries that are very heavily dependent on Russia for energy, including the Baltic states, that have been the most outspoken. One of the things that troubles me about all this, and it gets at your point, is we've seen splits and divisions in Europe that don't break down new, old, east-west, north-south. Europe is a bit of a mess right now. And I'm actually worried with the Swedish election.
Putin is very popular with the extreme right in Europe.
Oh, absolutely. No, and that's terrifying in its own.
They like you.
No, they do. Marie Le Pen. No, Marie Le Pen. One of the things, I just came back from Sweden. I'm very worried about the Swedish election because Sweden has been a leader on these issues. Democracy in general, but dealing with Russia in particular. You have a new government now that seems to me to be quite different. And so we can't afford to lose leaders in Europe, and I fear we've lost one in the case of Sweden. The issue with Germany, and I know we're running out of time, I apologize, I obviously can't help myself, is the coalition government. Merkel, if left on her own, I think would be taking an even tougher position than she has, and I think she's staked out a pretty tough position. But when you have the Social Democrats and Steinmeier, it's hard to do. It's very hard to do. Sorry.
Well, I have a quick question.
That's always a setup. But anyway.
A quick four-part question.
To be more specific to the previous question, how do we as the U.S. target Gazprom and Russia's oil exports adequately or enough when that would kind of cripple the European economies? I mean, wouldn't that seem selfish if the U.S. takes that approach? Wouldn't that kind of, I don't know, maybe tick off our European allies? We don't have nearly as much stake in this conflict as the EU and NATO nations do, or the European NATO nations. So wouldn't it be almost counterproductive for the U.S. to take this sort of strategy, as it might alienate our European allies?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The answer is yes and no. And we don't depend on Gazprom. Europe does. But as I said before, Gazprom is the entity that actually has cut off gas to Ukraine. And if we are interested in targeting Russian either individuals or entities that are creating problems for Ukraine, Gazprom is at the top of that list. The U.S. has the luxury of imposing sanctions on Russian entities that Europe just doesn't have the stomach for. And, the Europeans have done fairly well for the most part. But there is the extraterritorial nature of U.S. sanctions. And I've worked on sanctions inside the government dealing with Belarus. When the U.S. imposes sanctions on an entity or an entity, an individual or an entity, it forces other players, banks, companies, to choose, do I want to be in good standing with the United States, or do I want to do business with a sanctioned entity? Look at the French bank. I always
Société Générale.
Yeah,
No,
PNB.
BNP Paribas.
BNP. I always get the letters mixed up, sorry. BNP, $9 billion fine for doing business with sanctioned countries, sanctioned governments. I think there is a risk to it. I think the Europeans would not be very happy about it. But it seems to me that Gazprom is front and center at this crisis. And they continue to try to demand a very high price from Ukraine to pay for gas imports. And so I think we have to do it because there aren't a lot of other targets left for us. We could try to kick Russia out of the SWIFT banking system, which I'm in favor of as well, which would, I think, do quite serious damage to Russian banks. We could go after higher level people. I actually am not sure what the point is in talking with Sergei Lavrov. He's a born liar. And so is Putin. I mean, remember, Putin is the one who said there are no Russian troops in Crimea. It was a complete and total lie. So at a certain point, if you want to go after people, you got to go after the top. I realize that is a glib thing to say, but at a certain point, you have to go after the people at the highest levels. Lukashenko, very different leader. But not to compare Belarus and Russia, but Lukashenko was one of the first people we put on the sanctions list. Mugabe and others. But sanctions are not an easy thing to do. But I think in this case we don't have much choice.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. It's been a great pleasure having a person of the highest level, at least in the public debate over this issue, join us tonight.
Or at least at Freedom House, if nowhere else.
Please join me in thanking him.
Thank you. Great job.
Thanks. We're going to have dinner.
Okay, great.
Can Russia afford not to sell gas to Europe?
That's a great question because Russia can't just flip a switch and send it to the east.
Well, no, it can flip a switch. The point is,